marriage certificate still exists in the Mississippi State Archives, yellowed and brittle, bearing the names of Jonathan Mercer and Martha, listed simply as property beneath his signature. What makes this document so disturbing isn't just the grotesque nature of the union between a plantation owner and his enslaved cook, but the 13 mysterious deaths that followed in the months after their wedding ceremony in March 1854. Local newspapers from that era, carefully preserved in private collections, hint at a conspiracy so elaborate and cruel that authorities buried the investigation to protect some of the South's most prominent families. The truth behind this forced marriage reveals a web of betrayal, revenge, and systematic torture that shocked even the violence-hardened Antebellum South. Before we return to Jonathan Mercer and the fate that awaited him at Rosewood Plantation, let me take you back to a time when honor meant everything, and broken trust could destroy a man in ways far worse than death. The events that led to that unholy marriage began 15 years earlier in the murky backwaters of the Mississippi Delta, where fortunes were made in human flesh and blood money flowed as freely as the muddy river itself. Jonathan Mercer wasn't born into the plantation aristocracy that defined Mississippi society in the 1840s. The son of a failed tobacco farmer from Virginia, he arrived in Natchez in 1839 with nothing but ambition burning in his chest and a willingness to engage in business that more established gentlemen wouldn't touch with their finest gloves. The slave trade, while legal, carried a social stigma among the old planter families, who preferred to maintain the fiction that their wealth came from cotton alone, not from the systematic buying and selling of human beings. It was in the sweltering summer of 1840 that Mercer formed his partnership with Charles Denton and Captain Robert Gaines, two men whose desperation matched his own ruthless ambition. Denton, the youngest son of a declining cotton dynasty, needed money to save his family's plantation from creditors. Gaines, a former riverboat captain who had lost everything to yellow fever and bad investments, possessed invaluable knowledge of the illegal slave routes from Cuba and the Caribbean islands. Together, they established what they called the Delta Trading Company, operating from a warehouse on the outskirts of Natchez, where the law's reach grew thin and questions weren't asked about the source of their merchandise. The business proved more profitable than any of them had dared imagine. While legitimate slave traders dealt in documented property with clear titles and health certificates, Mercer's operations specialized in what they euphemistically called recovery services. They purchased enslaved people who had escaped from failing plantations, bought kidnapped free blacks from corrupt bounty hunters, and most lucratively smuggled fresh captives from illegal ships that still crossed the Atlantic despite the official ban on international slave trade. The profit margins were extraordinary because their operating costs were minimal. They cared nothing for the health, housing, or basic humanity of their merchandise. For 3 years, the partnership flourished in the shadows of Southern society. They reinvested their profits into legitimate businesses, buying respectability along with property. Denton saved his family's estate and expanded it into one of the most productive cotton plantations in Adams County. Gaines purchased a fleet of riverboats and became a respected shipping magnate. Mercer himself acquired Rosewood Plantation, a modest but profitable cotton operation about 40 miles upriver from Natchez, complete with a grand colonial mansion that announced his arrival into Mississippi's planter elite. But success bred carelessness, and carelessness attracted attention. In the spring of 1843, word reached them that federal marshals were investigating illegal slave trading operations along the Gulf Coast. Someone had been asking questions about their business, examining shipping records, and worst of all, interviewing some of their former merchandise who had managed to escape or gain freedom. The three partners met an emergency session in Mercer's new study at Rosewood, surrounded by leather-bound books he couldn't read, and oil paintings of ancestors who weren't his own. The tension in that room was suffocating as each man realized that their empire of human misery was about to collapse. Denton, always the most nervous of the three, suggested they dissolve the partnership immediately and destroy all records of their transactions. Gaines, with his sailor's pragmatism, argued for a more measured approach, shifting their assets offshore and waiting for the investigation to pass. But Mercer had a different solution, one that revealed the true depths of his moral bankruptcy. He had already decided to eliminate his partners and steal their combined assets, But he needed a plan that would remove suspicion from himself while silencing the two men who knew enough to destroy him. The solution came to him with the cold clarity of pure evil. He would murder both men and arrange the scene to suggest they had killed each other in a dispute over money. The murder took place on a humid evening in June 1843 at the warehouse that had served as their base of operations. Mercer had arranged the meeting under the pretense of planning their exit strategy. He chose the location carefully. The warehouse district was largely abandoned after sunset, and the building itself was scheduled for demolition the following month, as the city expanded its commercial port facilities. Mercer arrived early, concealing a loaded pistol in his coat and a razor-sharp knife in his boot. His plan was brutally simple. Shoot Denton first, then stage a knife fight with Gaines that would end with both men dead and him claiming self-defense. He had even prepared false witnesses, dock workers who would swear they'd seen Denton and Gaines arguing violently earlier that day over missing money. When his partners arrived, they found Mercer already seated at their usual table, a bottle of expensive whiskey and 3 glasses arranged between stacks of ledgers and shipping documents. The conversation began normally with Denton reviewing the legal threats they faced, and Gaines outlining a plan to transfer their assets to Havana, beyond the reach of U.S. law. But as the evening wore on and the whiskey flowed, Mercer steered the discussion toward their accumulated wealth, specifically the location of the cash reserves they'd hidden in various banks. It was Gaines who first sensed something wrong, noticing how Mercer's hand kept drifting toward his coat pocket. When Gaines suggested they postpone the meeting and reconvene the next day with lawyers present, Mercer knew his window was closing. The violence erupted with shocking suddenness. Mercer drew his pistol and fired directly into Denton's chest before the younger man could react. The shot echoed through the empty warehouse and Denton collapsed backward in his chair, blood spreading across his white shirt. But Gaines, despite being caught off guard, proved more resilient than Mercer had anticipated. The seasoned captain overturned the heavy table and lunged with a broken whiskey bottle, slashing Mercer's face and leaving a permanent scar. What followed was a desperate struggle that lasted far longer than Mercer had planned. They crashed through crates, scattered ledgers across the floor, and left blood trails on every surface as they fought for control of the knife Mercer had drawn. In the end, it was age that betrayed Gaines. At 53, he simply couldn't match the younger man's strength. Mercer finally drove the blade deep into his stomach, twisting it upward toward the heart, while the old sailor clawed desperately at his throat. Even as Gaines died, he gasped words that would haunt Mercer forever. "My son knows everything. He'll come for you." At the time, Mercer dismissed it as the ravings of a dying man. He had no idea that Charles Denton's younger brother, Thomas, had been secretly documenting their illegal activities, or that Captain Gaines's 17-year-old son, Edward, possessed detailed knowledge of every transaction, every contact, and every crime the Delta Trading Company had committed. Mercer spent the next 4 hours methodically arranging the crime scene to support his story. He placed Denton's body in a position suggesting the man had been shot while reaching for a weapon, then positioned Gaines nearby with a bloody knife in his hand and defensive wounds that implied a struggle between the two victims. He scattered money around the room to suggest a dispute over finances, damaged the office safe to imply a robbery gone wrong, and even inflicted additional wounds on his own hands and arms to support his claim of being an innocent bystander caught in their violent quarrel. The false witnesses performed exactly as paid, testifying that they had seen Denton and Gaines arguing earlier about missing partnership funds. A dockworker claimed he'd heard shouting followed by gunshots. Most crucially, Mercer presented himself as a mediator who had walked into a deadly confrontation. The Natchez police, overwhelmed by more pressing matters and eager to close a case involving 3 businessmen of relative standing, accepted Mercer's version with little investigation. The official report concluded that Denton and Gaines had killed each other in a business dispute, with Mercer barely escaping the same fate. Within a week, the warehouse was demolished as planned, erasing physical evidence. With his partners dead, Mercer moved quickly to consolidate his newfound wealth, producing forged documents showing Denton and Gaines had agreed to transfer their shares to him in the event of death. Banks that had once eyed the 3-man operation with suspicion readily accepted the word of a single planter who now appeared legitimate. Over the following months, Mercer systematically emptied every account, safe deposit box, and hidden cache of money that had belonged to his murdered partners. The total was staggering, nearly $40,000, the equivalent of a fortune in today's terms. More importantly, he had eliminated the only two men who could directly connect him to the Delta Trading Company's illegal activities. With the evidence destroyed and his rivals buried, Mercer could reinvent himself as a respectable member of Mississippi society. But Mercer had miscalculated. In his obsession with money and immediate threats, he overlooked the families of the men he murdered. Charles Denton's younger brother Thomas was 22 when he learned of Marcus's death. Unlike his reckless older brother, Thomas possessed a calculating patience that made him far more dangerous. He had maintained detailed ledgers of every Delta Trading Company transaction, coded records of illegal slave purchases, manifests from prohibited Caribbean routes, and even correspondence with corrupt officials. He had never trusted Mercer, noting inconsistencies in his history and finances long before the murders. When the news reached him, Thomas's grief turned instantly to cold fury. At the same time, Edward Gaines, the 17-year-old son of the slain captain, was piecing together his own evidence. Educated in law and banking, Edward had access to information Thomas did not. While Thomas sought direct proof of Mercer's guilt, Edward focused on exploiting Mercer's financial weaknesses. By 1844, both men had come to the same conclusion. Mercer had murdered their kin and stolen their livelihoods. Meeting for the first time in Natchez the following year, they realized their skills and resources were complementary. Together, they vowed to spend as long as it took to destroy Jonathan Mercer in the same way he had destroyed their families, methodically, patiently, and mercilessly. Their first step was infiltration. Thomas began attending the same gentlemen's clubs and political gatherings as Mercer, posing as a harmless acquaintance. Within months, Mercer considered him nothing more than another planter's son, someone safe to drink whiskey with but not a threat. Meanwhile, Edward used his connections in Natchez banks to trace Mercer's every financial move. He discovered that Mercer's apparent wealth was built on risky investments, leveraged loans, and an ever-deepening gambling addiction. Mercer regularly lost thousands in poker games and horse racing, covering his debts by mortgaging Rosewood's future cotton crops. The young men seized upon this flaw. Edward manipulated loan renewals at First National Bank, structuring payment schedules to create maximum pressure during planting seasons. Meanwhile, Thomas bribed gambling house operators to keep Mercer in games where the other players worked together to ensure his losses. Bit by bit, Mercer was being squeezed. By 1851, his debts had grown to nearly $30,000, and the interest alone consumed most of Rosewood's annual profits. Rumors spread that the once proud plantation was teetering on ruin. But Thomas and Edward wanted more than financial collapse. They wanted Mercer humiliated, stripped of dignity, and forced to live in daily torment before death finally claimed him. The plan that emerged was as twisted as it was brilliant. Mercer would be forced into a marriage with one of his own slaves, a grotesque spectacle that would ruin his reputation permanently. They chose Martha, Rosewood's head cook, not by accident but by design. At 38, she was a large woman, but her size was the least of her significance. She had been purchased by Mercer in 1847, torn away from her husband and children who were sold elsewhere. When she begged Mercer to buy at least her youngest daughter, he laughed and refused, saying he wasn't running an orphanage. From that moment on, Martha's hatred of him burned cold and constant. She performed her duties with efficiency, but her contempt was barely concealed. Unbeknownst to Mercer, Martha had already been quietly undermining him. She salted his meals heavily to aggravate his stomach ailments, broke cherished possessions under the guise of accidents, and whispered rumors among the enslaved that their master was on the verge of financial ruin. Her knowledge of his routines, preferences, and weaknesses made her invaluable. When Thomas and Edward's intermediaries approached her through free people of color who traded in Natchez markets, she did not hesitate. She demanded only one thing in return for her cooperation: freedom, and safe passage to Canada where she might one day reunite with her surviving children. They agreed instantly. The trap was set in 1854 when Mercer, desperate to stave off foreclosure, entered a high-stakes poker tournament in Natchez. The gambling hall, tucked into a converted warehouse along the riverfront, was the perfect stage. Mercer arrived carrying nearly every liquid asset he had left: $8,000 scraped together from the sale of slaves and equipment. He believed he was one good night away from saving Rosewood. He didn't know the entire game was rigged. At first he won modestly enough to fuel his hope. But as the hours dragged on and the stakes grew, the other players, handpicked by Thomas and Edward, slowly bled him dry. By 2 a.m, he was down to his last $3,000. Convinced he had a winning hand, he shoved it all into the pot. But when the cards were revealed, his kings were crushed by a full house. Mercer was ruined. As he sat frozen in disbelief, a stranger at the table leaned forward, his voice low and calm. "Mr. Mercer, it seems we need to discuss your obligations." From the shadows stepped Thomas Denton, his resemblance to his murdered brother unmistakable. Mercer's blood ran cold. Then Edward Gaines emerged carrying a leather folder thick with documents. The trap had closed. They confronted him with everything: the murders, the theft, the forged papers, the laundered money. The evidence was overwhelming. Mercer whispered, "What do you want?" Edward smiled coldly. "Not money, not land. We already own all of that." Thomas leaned closer. "You're going to marry Martha, your cook, publicly, legally, permanently." The words hit Mercer like a death sentence. In Mississippi society, such a union wasn't just scandalous, it was social suicide. He protested, but they had already arranged a minister willing to perform the ceremony. There was no escape. Death in that warehouse or a life of humiliation at Rosewood. Mercer signed the marriage contract with trembling hands, believing he could perhaps find a loophole later. But he underestimated his enemies. The following evening, before neighbors and acquaintances, Jonathan Mercer stood beside Martha as the vows were read. She spoke clearly, her voice steady with dignity. When the minister ordered him to kiss his bride, Mercer nearly collapsed, but Martha steadied him with surprising gentleness, sealing their union with a brief kiss. The guests left in shock, whispering about Mercer's eccentricity. He returned to Rosewood with his new wife, not realizing the true horror had only just begun. That first night in the same bed that had once been his sanctuary, Jonathan Mercer understood that Thomas Denton and Edward Gaines had devised a punishment more devastating than any noose or pistol. Martha lay beside him, calm, composed, and in absolute control. Every breath he took, every glance he cast toward her, reminded him that he had been forced into a union designed to grind away his dignity piece by piece. Death would have been merciful. At first, life in the house seemed strangely normal. To neighbors, Martha appeared to embrace her new role with grace. She managed the household staff, welcomed visitors politely, and even entertained other planters' wives who came out of morbid curiosity to see the strange arrangement for themselves. Some whispered that Mercer had suffered a religious conversion, that he was elevating Martha as a gesture of Christian benevolence. Others thought him mad. Yet outwardly the plantation still ran, and Mercer still signed his name on documents, though the ink in his hand trembled. But inside Rosewood, the walls were closing in. Mercer began to notice bitter undertones in his morning coffee, strange cramps after supper, and headaches that worsened whenever Martha prepared his meals. He dismissed it at first as stress, until one collapse forced him to call on Dr. Warren, the plantation's longtime physician. The doctor examined him and spoke carefully. His symptoms matched slow poisoning. Arsenic, perhaps. Something subtle administered over weeks and months. Mercer's heart froze. He knew then that Martha was no passive pawn in the conspiracy. She was a full partner, an avenger with every reason to hate him. But what could he do? If he accused her, Thomas and Edward would make certain his words sounded like the ravings of a madman. If he refused her food, people would whisper about his paranoia, and indeed they soon did. He prepared secret meals in his study, drank only from a hidden well, and locked himself at night in a guest room. But these precautions made him look insane, not cautious. Guests saw a gaunt, trembling man who wouldn't touch the food his doting wife set before him. Martha played her part flawlessly. She wept in front of neighbors about her husband's decline, about how he wouldn't let her care for him. To the outside world, she looked like a devoted wife saddled with a husband whose mind was unraveling. Mercer's every attempt to save himself became evidence of madness. Even Dr. Warren, when Mercer begged him to investigate the possibility of poison, shook his head sadly. "Your nerves are broken, Mr. Mercer. You must find peace of mind." By late spring of 1854, Jonathan Mercer was trapped in a nightmare. His enemies had orchestrated everything: his financial ruin, his social humiliation, and now his physical destruction at the hands of his own wife. And he could do nothing but watch it happen, day after day, meal after meal. The breaking point came on the night of their 3-month wedding anniversary. Martha organized a dinner party, inviting neighbors, the doctor, and respected families of the parish. Mercer spent the day eating bread he'd prepared himself, determined to touch nothing she served. But Martha unveiled a surprise: a dusty bottle of wine supposedly aged in the cellar for years. She opened it at the table, poured it herself, and lifted a glass with a smile. "To our marriage," she declared. Mercer froze. If he refused to drink, his guests would see not a cautious man but a lunatic convinced his wife was trying to kill him. They would whisper that he was unhinged, perhaps even dangerous. And so, with his neighbor's eyes on him, he raised the glass and drank. The poison struck quickly. His throat burned, his stomach twisted, and sweat poured down his face. He gasped for air as he collapsed on the dining room floor. Guests rushed to help. Dr. Warren knelt beside him, but Martha flung herself across his body, wailing, "Save him! Please save my husband." Her tears fell onto his chest as she clutched at him, blocking every attempt to administer aid. To the guests, it looked like devotion. To Mercer, it was the final cruelty. She leaned close, whispering so only he could hear. "Charles Denton was my cousin. Robert Gaines was my uncle. I've waited 9 years for this moment." The room blurred as darkness closed in. The last sound Mercer heard was the sobbing voice of his wife performing grief, the sound of neighbors consoling her, utterly convinced that he had died a broken, unstable man. At 9:47 p.m., Jonathan Mercer, once a ruthless master of men, was pronounced dead of nervous exhaustion. His funeral was well attended. Martha played the part of the grieving widow with perfection, receiving sympathy from women who clasped her hands and promised to help her manage Rosewood. Not one person suspected she had killed him. To society, he was remembered as an eccentric planter who had ruined himself with gambling and made a bizarre marriage in his final months. The truth in that he had been executed by patience, poison, and vengeance had remained buried. Within a month, Martha signed papers transferring the plantation to Thomas Denton and Edward Gaines, wiping away debts in exchange. Then she vanished, heading north, likely toward Canada and freedom. Some whispered she found her children again. Others said she remarried and lived quietly, carrying her secret like a sacred fire. Rosewood Plantation did not die with Mercer. Thomas and Edward transformed it into something their fathers would have blessed: a refuge. Escaped slaves found shelter there, hidden in cellars and smokehouses until they could move farther north. The grand house where Mercer had dreamed of power became a station on the Underground Railroad, a beacon of freedom forged from the ruins of his cruelty. And Jonathan Mercer? He disappeared from history. No monuments, no heirs, no legacy. His name was erased. His story told only in whispers among families who knew what justice had looked like in that haunted year of 1854. They spoke of a revenge so carefully planned it took a decade to bloom, of a punishment so perfect it mirrored the crime. He had murdered partners for profit and stolen their lives. Their children had stolen his life in return, slowly, publicly, and with a cruelty that ensured his memory would rot. To the world, Jonathan Mercer became a cautionary tale, a planter ruined by bad choices and eccentric behavior. To those who knew the truth, his story was a reminder that justice sometimes wears no robe and sits in no court. Sometimes it waits patiently, gathering strength, until the day it can look a murderer in the eyes and make him drink the cup he poured for others. And so the brittle marriage certificate in the Mississippi State Archives remains, a piece of parchment that records the unthinkable union of a master and his enslaved cook. It is the last surviving witness to a revenge that rewrote a man's destiny and turned a symbol of his wealth into a monument to his destruction.